The oldest sentence ever written may be sitting in a museum display case right now, and nobody has read it. Not because it is damaged or lost, but because we have only just worked out that it is a sentence at all. Today, we are examining the linguistic theory behind something called iconographic writing, and the research that claims this system was in use on every continent except Antarctica for at least 70,000 years. By the end of this episode, you will understand what iconographic writing actually is, why its geographic scope is so extraordinary, and why the chronological depth of the record it left behind forces us to completely rethink when human beings first began recording their world. I am joined today by someone who has spent considerable time inside this research, and I want to start right at the beginning. What exactly are we talking about here?
So the research comes from a scholar publishing under the name An Unknown Soldier. And the central claim is this. There is an archaic writing system that has been hiding in plain sight for the entirety of modern archaeology, and it has been misidentified consistently as art. The author calls it iconographic writing, and the defining characteristic that separates it from every other writing system we know of is that it modulates visual information rather than verbal information.
Right, and that distinction, visual versus verbal, that is doing a lot of work in this theory. Can you unpack that a bit?
It is the crux of everything, really. Every writing system we currently recognize, hieroglyphics, cuneiform, the Latin alphabet, all of them are encoding spoken language. They are transcriptions of sound. Iconographic writing, as the research describes it, does something fundamentally different. It encodes people, places, and things that are critical to social life, and it does so through visual symbols that carry meaning independently of any spoken language. The author makes the point that this is precisely why it could function across the entire globe. It was not tied to any one language.
So it is not a picture of a word, it is a picture of a concept or a place or a person.
Exactly. And the research offers a rather elegant modern analogy for this. Think about the icons on your smartphone. Each one represents a specific application, and it evokes a range of actions you can perform with it. You do not need to speak any particular language to understand what the camera icon does. Now, the research suggests our ancestors organized their iconographs in exactly the same way, in structural and functional groups, like organizational flowcharts, frequently used symbols in prominent positions, less common ones arranged around them.
That is a genuinely useful way to think about it. So, the discovery itself, how did it begin?
The author traces it to 2011 in Cardiff, Wales, at the National Museum of Wales. The artifact is called the Bryn Cellythi Pattern Stone, a megalith discovered buried beneath a mound on the Isle of Anglesey in 1929. In archaeological contexts, radiocarbon dated to around 3,500 BC. The author accidentally deciphered what he describes as an inscription on this stone, and that decipherment led him to a broader realization that what archaeology had been calling prehistoric art was, in fact, a formal writing system.
And from one stone in Wales, the research eventually expanded to cover the entire globe. That is quite a trajectory.
It is, and the research is correspondingly vast. The author states that his documented analysis now exceeds 3,500 images and 1.7 million words, formatted across more than 6,500 pages. That is not a casual observation. That is a career's worth of systematic documentation.
Right. So let us get into the structure of the system itself. The research describes specific rules of compositional syntax. What are those?
There are three core rules. The first is that every composition had to look like the realm it documented, meaning the borders and general details were based on cartography. The second rule is that the king had to look like the kingdom, which the research argues explains all those elaborate headdresses we see in ancient cultures worldwide. And the third rule is that every station of the nobility and many domains of what the author calls the learned had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, almost always in geophysical relationship to each other.
So these compositions are not decorative, they are constitutional documents.
That is precisely how the research frames them. The author describes the nobility of the archaic world as living, breathing, walking, talking constitutions. The regalia they wore were documents identifying every station within the kingdom and the relationship of each station to all others. It is a remarkable reframing of what we thought we understood about ancient governance.
And the cartographic element, that is where the method called soloromancy comes in, yes?
Yes. The research describes Soloromancy as an archaic priestly practice of using the sun and a staff to produce accurate cartographic surveys. The process is straightforward in principle. You plant a staff upright, mark the tip of its shadow at 2 points during the day, draw a line between those points, and you have a perfect east to west reference line. From there, you can measure azimuths to distant landmarks and build up an accurate map of a region. The author demonstrates this using the example of Moses on Mount Sinai, correlating the biblical account of the burning bush to a cartographic survey of the Sinai Peninsula.
That is a striking application of the theory. Now, let us move to what the research calls the geographic breadth of the iconographic record, because this is where the first major claim lands. The research asserts that this writing system was in use on every continent except Antarctica prior to 1800 BC. How does the evidence for that actually look?
The research walks through examples continent by continent, and the range is genuinely staggering. Let us start in Iberia, because that is where the author's second major breakthrough occurred after Wales. The Dama de Elche is a carved figure radiocarbon dated to around 400 BC, long regarded as a Carthaginian funerary urn. The author's analysis reveals that in profile, the Dama de Elche corresponds to a cartographic outline of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal in isolation. He describes this as nearly irrefutable.
And the Dama de Elche is not an isolated case in Iberia.
Not at all. The research traces the same kindred iconography in Iberia back to a figure carved on the leg bone of a goat, radiocarbon dated to 14,500 BC. The author describes this as the earliest identified antecedent to the Dama de Elche, meaning there is a documented continuity of noble regalia on the Iberian Peninsula spanning more than 14,100 years. And there are regalia necklaces found as grave goods in Iberia dated to 11,500 BC, which the research connects to the same compositional tradition.
14,100 years of continuity in a single iconographic tradition. That is longer than the entirety of what we currently call recorded history.
It is, and the research makes that point explicitly. The author argues that a nobility reigned on the Iberian Peninsula for longer than accredited academia once admitted the capacity of verbal speech. That is a deliberately provocative framing, but it is grounded in the dating evidence he presents.
What about Egypt? Because the relationship between iconographic writing and Egyptian hieroglyphics is central to the theory.
This is one of the most intellectually interesting parts of the research. The author argues that Egyptian hieroglyphics did not emerge from nowhere. They represent what he calls the morphological interface between iconographic writing and pictographic writing. In his framing, Egypt upgraded from the global iconographic system to a phonetic pictographic system beginning with the First Dynasty. He uses the analogy that Egypt moved to Twitter while its neighbors remained with conventional mail, meaning Egypt's conversations were preserved in a readable form, while the rest of the world's iconographic record was obscured.
And the Egyptian gods themselves, Horus, Sobek, Bast, the research has a specific explanation for those.
Yes. The author argues that each Egyptian deity is a bust depicting regional geology of Africa in what he calls anamorphic similes. If the geology of your kingdom resembled a particular bird or animal when viewed from above, the head of your king was depicted with that animal's head. Horus, for instance, originates in geology west of the Nile that resembles a perched Egyptian black kite. The Great Pyramids of Giza, in this reading, are situated precisely on the nose of Horus in the cartographic composition, because the nose in iconographic compositions always marked the sovereign's mountain, and the Nile Delta had no natural prominence.
So the pyramids are not just monuments, they are a cartographic marker.
In the research's framework, yes. They are the solution to a geographic problem. How do you mark the sovereign's position in a flat delta? You build the mountain that nature did not provide.
Let us move north, because the Scandinavian evidence is particularly interesting from a logical standpoint.
This is where the research makes what I think is one of its most elegant arguments. In Norway, in the regions surrounding modern Oslo, a series of elaborately hewn and polished maces, axes, and hammers have been found as grave goods. The author identifies one of these as an item of official regalia, featuring an iconograph used by officials on every continent. The radiocarbon date on the burial of this regalia mace is 8000 BC, more than 5,000 years before the invention of hieroglyphics in Egypt.
8000 BC in Oslo. That is extraordinary on its own. But the glaciation argument makes it even more significant, doesn't it?
This is the logical proof I find most compelling in the entire research. Everything north of Denmark lay under continental glaciers 3 kilometers thick until around 9300 BC. No human being could have lived in Scandinavia between approximately 125,000 BC and 9,300 BC. That means any iconographic convention found in Scandinavia must have been imported. It could not have been invented there. And because the iconographic conventions in Scandinavia follow the same compositional rules as those found everywhere else in the world, the research concludes that those rules were already a global standard before Scandinavians even arrived in the region.
So Scandinavia functions as a kind of chronological anchor for the whole system.
Exactly. The author describes it as a calibrating frame of reference. What is found to be an iconographic convention in Scandinavia must have been an iconographic convention in all other regions of the world. It is a genuinely elegant piece of reasoning.
And the research also covers China with the oracle bones.
Yes, in pre-dynastic China, around 4000 BC, people began burying their dead with carved and inscribed bones, mainly on turtle shells and bovine scapulas. Accredited academia has known for at least a century that the inscriptions on these oracle bones constitute a formal writing system, but the research notes they have not been formally acknowledged as such because they have not been fully deciphered. The author claims to have made a partial attribution, connecting the turtle shell specifically to the upper Yangtze and the Sichuan basin, and he describes the script as what he calls an iconographic markup language, a form of proto-pictographic writing along the innovation curve leading to formal pictographic writing.
And Australia features prominently as well.
Australia is particularly significant in the research. The author has deciphered cave paintings there, which he describes as documents, not art, featuring noblemen wearing complete sets of regalia. He argues that the compositions in Australia follow the same rules of compositional syntax as those found everywhere else, and he raises the possibility that thermoluminescence dating, a method that measures the degradation of refractory properties in ancient paints, may eventually reveal Australian cave paintings to be far older than currently acknowledged. The cave paintings in southern France, for instance, were formerly attributed to around 17,000 BC, but thermoluminescence dating returned dates of 60,000 BC.
Wait, 60,000 BC for cave paintings that were thought to be 17,000 years old? That is not a minor revision.
It is a seismic one. And the research notes that even the art-first school of linguistics, the school that argues human beings drew pictures before they developed verbal language, was shocked by those results. The thermoluminescence method is significant because it can date inorganic materials, specifically the ancient paints themselves, rather than relying on organic matter nearby. The challenge is that it requires in situ analysis, which means field expeditions to remote locations with specialized equipment, and removing samples is not considered ethical.
So the geographic case is built on examples from Wales, Iberia, Egypt, Norway, Denmark, China, Australia, and more. That is the breadth. Now let us get into the chronological depth, because this is where the research makes its most breathtaking claims.
The chronological depth is where the research becomes genuinely difficult to absorb. Let us work backwards from the more recent and move toward the more ancient. We have already established 8,000 BC in Norway and 14,500 BC in Iberia. The next significant stop is a bone carving of a bison found on the handle of a spear-throwing device called an atlatl in southern France, radiocarbon dated to 17,000 BC.
And that was previously interpreted as prehistoric art.
Precisely. The art-first school of linguistics would classify this as an example of pre-verbal humans expressing themselves through imagery. The research rejects that interpretation entirely, arguing instead that this is a composition in a formal writing system. Moving further back, we reach the Venus of Willendorf, found near Willendorf in what is today Germany, radiocarbon dated to approximately 29,000 BC. The research notes that this is also a ceramic artifact, and that the earliest known ceramics are found in that region, nearly 22,000 years before the next oldest ceramic record in Japan at around 7,000 BC.
And the Venus of Willendorf in the researcher's reading is not a fertility figure or a piece of art.
It is a composition in an archaic writing system. That is the author's claim. And then we reach what he describes as the Lion Man, an anthropomorphic figure with a lion's head, radiocarbon dated to 40,000 BC, found in the region of what is today the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The research identifies this not merely as a figurine, but as an item of regalia identifying what the author calls the Lion King of the Lower Danube region. At 40,000 BC, we are, as the author puts it, as far from the naked ape of cultural anthropology as we can possibly get.
And then the cave paintings revised to 60,000 BC by thermoluminescence dating.
Yes. And then we reach what the research describes as the most important single artifact in the entire chronological argument, the Blombos Cave ochre, from the southern coast of Africa. This is a small piece of ochre, only a few centimeters long, incised with a triangular grid pattern and bore dimples. It was deposited in sediments near what archaeologists call the Toba layer, the geological marker left by the eruption of Sumatra's largest caldera. That places the artifact at no older than 75,000 BC and no younger than 73,000 BC.
75,000 BC. And the research argues this is not abstract expression, it is a composition in a formal writing system.
The author makes the distinction carefully. He notes that the Art First school insisted humans were not capable of anything other than abstract expression until after the Younger Dryas period. But the triangular grid on the Blombos ochre is distinctly regular. It is non-abstract. And crucially, the research argues there is a documented continuity of triangular forms of iconography in Africa spanning 75,000 years of human history, from that piece of ochre all the way through to the Bantu script of the modern era.
The Bantu script is an interesting tangent here, actually, because it illustrates something quite profound about how information can be encoded visually.
It does. The Bantu script is described in the research as perhaps the most beautiful writing system that has ever existed, but it incorporated color as a component of the writing system itself. Color was a carrier of information. Some letters required 5 distinct colors to render correctly. The author notes, with some wry humor, that it is as impractical as writing in Old Entish. It takes a very long time to say anything, and you would not say anything unless it was worth taking a long time to say. But the point is serious. It demonstrates that our ancestors understood color itself as a medium for encoding meaning.
And the research draws a parallel between color as an information carrier and DNA as an information carrier.
Yes, the author makes the observation that genetic researchers have definitively identified the age of human DNA, and that DNA became distinct in our species approximately 6 million years ago. He uses this to make a broader point about the gap between what archaeology can prove and what genetic analysis suggests, a gap he describes as potentially 2.8 million years of missing links. His argument is that the iconographic record may eventually help close some of that gap.
Now, the research does not stop at 75,000 BC. There is one more stop in what the author calls the Wayback Machine.
The Rising Star Cave Complex in southern Africa. In 2014, spelunkers exploring the deepest recesses of this cave system, a portion inaccessible even to rodents, discovered human remains covered by flowstone. Flowstone accumulation rates are well established, and the flowstone in the Rising Star Cave Complex has been determined to be no less than 365,000 years old. Among the remains was a single owl claw talisman.
365,000 years old, and the research connects that owl claw to the iconographic tradition.
The author is careful here. He states he will not risk a formal attribution until the published research from the excavation team is available, and that exploitation of the site is still ongoing. But he notes that the kindreds of that region of southern Africa, in the modern world, in antiquity, and in the archaic, all identified themselves with the great horned owl. And he makes the observation that the reason an individual wore an owl talisman in 2023 AD may be the same reason an individual wore one in 365,000 BC. He describes this as a threshold that, if crossed, would end any attempt to classify certain groups of humans as a subspecies.
That is a significant ethical and scientific point. The research is not just about linguistics. It has implications for how we understand human equality across deep time.
Absolutely. The author is explicit about this. If a writing system can be demonstrated in use at 365,000 BC, it collapses every narrative that has ever been used to argue for cognitive hierarchy between human groups. The research frames this as one of its most important potential contributions, not just to linguistics, but to our understanding of what it means to be human.
Now, the research also proposes new dating methods, the iconographic dating method and something called differential refractory dating. Can you explain those?
The iconographic dating method is one the author introduces but deliberately does not fully explain in this paper. He describes it as a gift he is saving for a later publication. The principle, as far as we can understand it, is that because iconographic conventions evolved in traceable ways, the style and composition of an artifact can be used to date it independently of radiocarbon or other physical methods. Differential refractory dating is more straightforward in concept. It would measure the difference in refractory properties between weathered and recently carved surfaces of minerals to determine how long a carved surface has been exposed to the elements. The author acknowledges this is above his current resources to develop, but argues it is technically feasible.
And Ireland's Newgrange Monument is mentioned as a potential calibration baseline for that method.
Yes, because the mineral surfaces inside Newgrange have not been exposed to the elements since the monument was constructed and carved, they represent a dataset that could help calibrate differential refractory dating. The author also mentions the petroglyphs of Scandinavia as a calibrating frame of reference, precisely because we know those carvings could not predate 9,300 BC. The glacial maximum provides a hard lower bound.
Let us talk about the numbers, because the research offers a figure that I think is the single most arresting statistic in the entire paper.
If the research's conclusions pass peer review and documented history is extended to 79,000 BC, then everything we currently call recorded history represents only 3.8% of the total written record. We have read 3.8% of what our ancestors wrote. And if the Rising Star Cave evidence eventually supports an attribution to 365,000 BC, that figure drops to 0.008%. The author invites his audience to meditate on that.
0.008%. That is not a gap in the record. That is the record being almost entirely unread.
And the author is clear that this is not a counsel of despair, it is an invitation. He describes the discovery as a gift that will yield many more gifts than can presently be counted. He notes that the British Isles alone hold over 3 million artifacts in national collections, and that if he devoted 5 minutes to each, he would need to work, not merely live, for 150 years just to complete a first pass. The scope of the work required is generational.
The research also proposes a new periodization of human history, replacing the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic framework with something different.
Yes, the author proposes demarcating what was once called prehistory using the terms archaic and ultant. The archaic world in his framework spans from the Toba eruption of approximately 80,000 BC to 1,800 BC. The ancient world covers 1,800 BC to the Common Era. He further divides the archaic into 4 epochs: the status quo ante before the Toba eruption, the catastrophe of the eruption itself, a survival epoch lasting 1 or 2 centuries, and a restoration epoch lasting several millennia. The Toba eruption, a near-extinction event from Sumatra's largest caldera, serves as the chronological anchor for the entire framework.
And the research is careful to distinguish between what it can currently demonstrate and what it anticipates future work will reveal.
The author is consistent about this. He describes his published work as a prospective analysis, not a conclusive statement. He frames it as a demonstration of the importance of the narratives emerging from the iconographic record, and he is explicit that future generations will complete the work. He even invites his audience to participate, noting that the graphical protocols governing iconographic writing are learnable, and that anyone with a browser and access to museum catalogs could begin identifying compositions themselves.
There is something genuinely democratic about that invitation. This is not a discovery being locked away in a journal. It is being offered as a framework that anyone can apply.
And the author makes the point that crowdsourcing the effort is not just welcome, it is necessary. The scale of the artifact record is simply too large for any individual or small team to address. He describes it as a quest to rival all other quests, and he means that quite literally. The implications of reading the remaining 96% of the iconographic record are, in his words, beyond what can presently be counted.
Now, I want to raise the question of reception, because this research makes claims that are well outside current academic consensus. How does the author address that?
He addresses it directly and without defensiveness. He acknowledges that his findings will be hotly debated, and he states his confidence that after finding the same compositional conventions on every continent, his findings will pass peer review. He has submitted proprietary briefs to the affected governments of Europe and Australia. He is also candid about the limitations of his current position. He notes that differential refractory dating, for instance, is above his pay grade to develop, and that the Rising Star Cave attribution requires the published research from the excavation team before he will risk a formal claim.
That is a measured posture for someone making claims of this magnitude.
It is. And I think it is worth noting that the research does not ask anyone to simply accept its conclusions. It asks people to look. The author's method, what he calls the kinesthetic method, involves applying known material culture to compositions and seeing what emerges. He is inviting scrutiny, not deflecting it.
Let us also acknowledge the alternative viewpoint here, because not everyone in linguistics or archaeology would accept the premise that these artifacts constitute a writing system rather than art or symbolic expression.
That is a fair and important point. The art-first school of linguistics, which the research engages with extensively, holds that abstract and symbolic expression preceded verbal language, and that what we are looking at in these artifacts is exactly that, symbolic expression, not a formal writing system with rules of syntax. The research's counter-argument is that the compositional rules are too consistent, too globally distributed, and too structurally coherent to be explained as independent symbolic expression. But that is precisely the kind of claim that requires peer review and independent verification to settle.
And the research is explicit that it is offering a first interpretation, not a final one.
Consistently so. The author describes his published work as composed of his conclusions, with the documented correlations and interpretations to follow. He is sequencing the release of his research deliberately, theory first, then evidence. Whether that sequencing will satisfy academic reviewers is an open question, but the intellectual framework he is presenting is coherent and internally consistent.
So, when you step back from everything we have covered today, the geographic breadth, the chronological depth, the linguistic theory, the new dating methods, what does this research really come down to?
It comes down to a single radical reframing of human history. The research argues that writing, not as a transcription of speech, but as a visual system for encoding social and political reality, is not a product of the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. It is a product of the last 70,000 years at minimum, and possibly far longer. And because this system was visual rather than verbal, it could function across every language barrier on Earth, which is why the research finds the same compositional rules in Norway, in Iberia, in Egypt, in China, in Australia, and in Southern Africa.
And the implication for how we understand ourselves as a species is profound.
The author puts it this way: we are all about to discover an intelligent, literate form of life here on Earth. We are about to discover the lost tribes of Earth, and we are they. That is not a metaphor. He means it as a literal description of what the iconographic record, once fully read, will reveal about our ancestors.
Here is what this really comes down to for anyone listening. We began this episode with the observation that the oldest sentence ever written may be sitting in a museum right now, unread. And what the research of an unknown soldier suggests is that this is not a poetic exaggeration, it is a literal description of the current state of human knowledge. The Blombos Cave ochre at 75,000 BC, the Lion Man at 40,000 BC, the cave paintings revised to 60,000 BC by thermoluminescence dating, the Regalia Mace in Oslo at 8,000 BC, these are not isolated curiosities. According to this research, they are pages in a book we have only just learnt to open.
And the 3 rules of compositional syntax, that the composition must look like the realm, that the king must look like the kingdom, and that every station of the nobility must be represented within the boundary, those rules give us a key. Not just a key to reading individual artifacts, but a key to reconstructing the structure and function of every realm of the ancient world. The research describes this as the ability to reconstruct an accurate model of the body politic going back farther than most of us are currently willing to accept.
And the scale of what remains to be done is almost as staggering as the discovery itself. The British Isles alone hold over 3 million artifacts. If 3.8% of the record has been read at the 79,000 BC threshold, then the work ahead is not a project for a single scholar or a single generation. It is a project for all of us.
The author makes exactly that point. He describes the discovery as a gift that will yield many more gifts than can presently be counted, and he extends an open invitation. Learn the graphical protocols, search the museum catalogs, look at the artifacts that have been sitting in glass cases for centuries, and ask whether what you are looking at is art or language. The answer, the research suggests, may surprise you.
We started this episode by saying the oldest sentence ever written may be sitting in a museum right now, unread. The research of an unknown soldier suggests that sentence is not waiting for a more advanced civilization to come along and read it. It is waiting for this one, for people curious enough to look and patient enough to learn what they are looking at. That is a genuinely extraordinary invitation, and it is one that is open to everyone.